This last year for Brazil has been quite a roller coaster. It started off as a very antagonistic relationship. Back in July, Trump slapped an additional 40% of tariffs on Brazilian goods going into the US. The reason for that, the trial of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro on charges of trying to overthrow democracy after he lost the 2022 presidential election to President Lula, something that Trump described as a witch hunt. However, unlike so many world leaders, President Lula stood his ground. There was no way that he was going to let another country interfere in Brazil's affairs, especially not the US. And so, indeed, that trial came to a conclusion in September, and Bolsonaro was convicted to 27 years in prison. Now, since then, Trump and Lula have finally met. The first time was in September at the UN, and immediately after that meeting, Trump was already talking about the great chemistry that the two of them shared. They then met again in Kuala Lumpur, and they've talked on the phone. And back in November, Trump actually dropped most of the tariffs against Brazilian goods, and he now speaks very warmly about Brazil and about President Lula. So he's really changed his tune.
What about ordinary Brazilians in Brazil? What do they think of him?
Well, Brazilians have a love-hate relationship with the US and with Donald Trump. Those of them who love him are Bolsonaro supporters. They often wave American flags at Bolsonaro's rallies. Some of them even call on the US to intervene in Brazil. And of course, many of them refuse still to accept that Bolsonaro lost that 2022 election to Lula. Indeed, that is what led to the riots on January the 8th, 2023, when they stormed the presidential palace and the National Congress in Brasilia, a direct carbon copy of what had happened in the US 2 years earlier. Those Brazilians who hate Trump and the US, they're the ones whose family, whose friends suffered at the hands of the US-backed, the US-sponsored military dictatorship that ran from 1964 to 1985 and is still described as an open wound here in Brazil. But when it ended, they really believed that American interference here would end too. Then along comes Trump and his tariffs and his threats, and it did not go down well at all. So back in April, if we look at the research, he was already not a particularly popular figure here. About 58% of Brazilians had a negative opinion of Trump. After the tariffs were imposed, that went up to 63%. On the flip side, back in April, 38% of Brazilians had a positive view of Trump, and that slumped to 32% after the tariffs were imposed. So they're really not keen on the US president here in Brazil.
And apart from, as you were outlining there, Trump's dealings with Brazil, what about his role in the wider region? You know, I'm thinking of Venezuela and the removing of Nicolas Maduro. How did that go down in Brazil?
Well, that particular operation has had a huge impact on Brazil. In fact, President Lula has been one of the most outspoken critics condemning the military intervention in Venezuela. He wrote an article in the New York Times in which he said that the region will no longer be subservient to hegemonic endeavors. And then he goes on to say that building a prosperous, peaceful and pluralistic region is the only doctrine that suits us. Now, that's a clear reference to the so-called Donroe doctrine, in which Trump and the US claim that the Western Hemisphere belongs to the US. In fact, the title of this piece in the New York Times is "The Western Hemisphere Belongs to All of Us." Now, among the Brazilian society more widely, interesting that almost half of Brazilians actually supported the US intervention in Venezuela. However, the biggest impact of that intervention has been to create a sense of fear. 58% of Brazilians fear that Donald Trump could try and intervene here in Brazil like he did in Venezuela. And while that's unlikely to happen, certainly for the moment, it's absolutely certain that Trump will want to try and influence the result of the presidential elections here at the end of the year. How he tries to do that will be interesting to see, given that his strategy of the tariffs failed absolutely spectacularly back in July.